Everyone, I call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 93 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Indigenous and Northern Affairs. We recognize we meet on the unceded and traditional territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples. Colleagues, before we get into the continuation of the review of Clause C53 today, clause by clause review of C53, I'm going to just flag for us that the call is out for upcoming travel for committees. The travel period will be April to June, and our deadline for submission is February 16th. And so I'm not going to take any time on that today, but just planning the idea that the deadline is coming up. Should we finish early today, I may come back to it before we adjourn and see if anybody has anything they'd like to put forward for our clerk and team with the logistics team to cost out that we could submit for liaison committee consideration. But it is just give some thought to possible travel April to June of this spring and the deadline February 16th. So with that, we have a couple of new faces around the table today. I'd like to welcome Michelle Rempel-Garner and Mr. Melillo. Welcome, always good to have you here. And so today we are continuing with C53, an act respecting the recognition of certain Métis governments in Alberta, Ontario, and Saskatchewan. I'd like to welcome back our witnesses. We are hopefully drawing near the end of the time that we'll be spending with you, but we appreciate you, your continued presence and expertise in helping us move through this piece of legislation. We're going to pick up where we left off, and so where we're at right now is with a couple of stood clauses. And so we're going to resume with Clause 2. And so now just getting sorted out here. So CPC 2 was adopted, therefore we create a new section 4.1. And now we have CPC 1, which was Mr. Schmale's amendment. And so I'll ask Mr. Schmale if you'd like to move CPC 1.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I would like to move CPC 1.
Okay, any discussion on, does anyone have any discussion on CPC 1?
Can we hear it? I'm not. It was my understanding that we were going back to the taxation ones that we state. Is that there was an amendment created for this specific one? Where just tell me where we are in the overall scheme of we finish off the schedule and now we're coming back to which clauses.
Yeah. First of all, the clauses that were stood is Clause 2. So that's the one that we're on now. And then we had we stood Clauses 14 and 15 as well. So after Clause 2, we'll come back to Clause 14. Then we had a new Clause 14.1 brought about by CPC Amendment 5.01. And then we'll go to Clause 15, which was also stood. So those are the ones we need to deal with. And then we get into the final bit of business for today are some of the administrative things on short title. We have CPC 11 to still deal with. And then preamble title, bill, shall the bill carry, shall the chair report the bill, and then order a reprint of the bill for the House at report stage. So that's the business that's left to get through today. So we are at CPC 1, and that if you don't have it, was replacing line 28 on page 2 with the following, with treaty means except in sections 4.1 and 5, a treaty that is entered. So that's the clause that is before us at this point.
Okay, that looks good. We'll support that.
Okay, any other discussion on CPC 1? Okay, seeing none, we'll call the vote. How would you like to have the vote? Do you want recorded? Sure. Okay. So I'll turn it over to our clerk for a recorded vote on CPC 1.
Mr. Baptiste.
We are in support.
Mr. Carr.
In favor.
Ms. Gainey.
In favor.
Ms. Atwin.
In favor.
Mr. Schmale.
In favor.
Mr. Zimmer.
In favor.
Ms. Rempel-Garner. Mr. Melilot.
In favor.
Monsieur Le Maire.
En faveur.
Ms. Idlout.
Hangit po nga in favor.
10 yeas, no nays.
Okay, thank you. So CPC 1 carries. We now had NDP 1, but in this one, it was identical to CPC 1, and so because CPC 1 was moved and now adopted, NDP 1 is no longer in order, so we'll move after or beyond NDP 1. And so now we'll go to shall clause 2 carry as amended. Okay, on division. Okay, so it carries on division. Next, we will go to clause 14. And those of us who were here, there was a taxation discussion. There was some questions about an amendment, and so Mr. Viersen has put forward amendment CPC 5.01, but we are on clause 14. And so is there any discussion on clause 14? Okay, seeing none, we'll call the vote on clause 14. How would you like to do this? On division? Okay, so clause 14 carries on division. Now we have a new clause 14.1, and that's CPC Amendment 5.01. So yeah, it was Mr. Viersen's amendment, but I'll ask if anybody wants to move CPC 5.01. Where's 5.01?
An extra copy?
I'm trying to find it as well. So I can read it out. This was Mr. Viersen's CPC 5.01 amendment. It would be a new clause 14.1, and it reads, "For greater certainty, nothing in this act is to be construed as allowing for a treaty to be entered into by a Métis government and His Majesty in right of Canada that recognizes any right or claim in respect of land or resources." So that's what we have, Ms. Idlout.
Can you repeat the sentence? I don't have it in my notes.
Here, I can, Mr. Schmale will share it. But to repeat it, the new 14.1 would read, "For a greater certainty, nothing in this act is to be construed as allowing for a treaty to be entered into by a Métis government and His Majesty in right of Canada that recognizes any right or claim in respect of land or resources." So that's what was put forward. So Ms. Idlout, we'll go to you first.
Kuya Namik, I believe this is the amendment that we had discussed after our discussions about tax treatments, and became particularly important just having learned of some things. I know that what we've discovered during this whole process is that the Liberals didn't do a great job consulting in the beginning with First Nations, with other Métis, that they've tried to rush this bill forward, resulting in more questions being raised. We've heard a lot of testimony from First Nations and Métis regarding the concerns of what this bill could do regarding lands, territories, and resources. And I had made a similar amendment that I thought we would have had a chance to debate that we didn't get to. And then we heard later as well that the federal government is funding the Métis Nation of Ontario to secure lands in Ontario. So I think that we need to debate this with all honesty and needing the absolute assurance that we've been seeking about lands, territories, and resources, and that this bill really is only about internal governance. And I think that it's so important that if this is really only about internal governance, that this, including this clause, will help alleviate a lot of the concerns that this is not just going beyond internal governance. So I'm going to be in support of this amendment.
Okay, thanks, Ms. Sidlute. The issue procedurally that we have is that we haven't had this amendment moved yet. And so Mr. Vierson's not here. Any member is able to move it. And so I'll put the question out again if any member would like to move CPC 5.01.
I'll move.
Okay, so it is moved. So Ms. Sidlute, you've spoken then in favor of it. Does anybody else? Mr. Carr, I'll go to you next on my list, and then Mr. Batiste.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I'd like the input of the, what do you always call them? Technicians? I don't call you technicians. I never heard that before. The Shintz. I've never seen the guy before, but yeah, if we could get commentary from either Mr. Shintz, Mr. McLaughlin, Mr. Redmond on this, just a little bit of clarity. Particularly where I'm interested in is whether there's any repetition or redundancy here in terms of the non-derogation that we've spoken about at this committee prior to this point. That would be the first. And then depending on your answer, I may have a follow-up question just in terms of what this may prohibit in the future in terms of the ability for these governments, should the legislation pass, to expand and evolve on the nature of the relationship with the government. Thank you.
So this provision, this amendment, would do something a little bit different than those non-derogation provisions that the committee has already considered and adopted in the clause-by-clause review so far. So this would place a restriction on what could be included in the treaties in future. So it would limit the scope of those treaties. Now, the non-derogation provisions discuss the impact on the rights of others and say that there won't be any impact on the rights of others. So this is doing something a little bit different.
Just on that same line of questioning, is there precedence for that in previous legislation involving treaties? Because if I understand correctly, essentially this is predetermining the outcome of what a future treaty agreement could look like between these governments and the Government of Canada. If I've understood that correctly, please let me know. And if so, is there precedence for that in legislation involving treaties in other legislation?
So to my knowledge, there's no such provision in any other implementing legislation for a treaty or self-government agreement. Mind you, this is a little bit different as implementing legislation goes. Often there would be a treaty in hand for the committee to look at the same time as a bill coming into force. So there might not have been a need for that kind of discussion before, but to my knowledge, no such provision exists in other legislation.
I'm just wondering, Mr. Shintz, I don't know if this would be you, but are there any concerns that you feel the department may have or that stakeholders may have vis-a-vis the limitations that this would impose should it be adopted in the legislation?
I think agreeing wholeheartedly with everything Ms. Redmond has said, the department has increasingly taken the position that treaties are intended to have space to evolve over time as relationships evolve. And so while it's absolutely accurate to say that the self-government treaties that are contemplated to be implemented by this legislation, if it is given royal assent, are entirely limited to self-government, And as we've testified before, they're also intended to create space for further conversations over time. With each subsequent set of conversations, there are consultation obligations. There's the obligation that any jurisdictional discussion that is had will not have adverse impacts on other Indigenous groups and governments. And so this provision, which, as Ms. Redmond has said, is not seen in any other implementing legislation that I'm aware of, it is limiting in a way that is new, and I would say somewhat cuts against the department's position on these treaties needing space to evolve over time.
John, one more question on that. If adopted, is that, and this would be for Ms. Redmond, I think, would that be an area that these governments could challenge on a legal basis, that there is something that would prohibit the ability for it to evolve? So I guess the question is there some type of legal basis from which Indigenous governments are protected by a legislation or policy that would limit the ability for a treaty to evolve? Could there be some type of legal ramification from that?
I mean, the very vague answer is that anyone can challenge any legislation at any time. The chances of success are a different question. Implementing legislation for treaties, as I've described before, is usually fairly straightforward. We've seen a lot of these kind of standard provisions in this same bill. But otherwise, they don't normally get into more detail about what would be included in the treaty, because oftentimes the treaty that is being implemented by a particular statute has already been drafted and signed by the time that implementing bill comes before Parliament. So it's a bit of a tough question to answer in that this is a little bit of a different process than we've sometimes seen before with implementing statutes for treaties.
Okay, but just, you said there's two different things. I appreciate that, the difference between the ability to challenge versus the likelihood of success. In your legal opinion, looking at this, do you see a high probability of a legal challenge being accepted on the basis of what's in this amendment?
I mean, I would say that gets into me giving legal advice to the committee, which I'm unfortunately not in a position to do. I would, again, reiterate that that kind of provision would be novel in implementing legislation, and that would be something to consider in moving forward with that.
Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Okay, Mr. Batiste, you're next on my list.
Yeah, thanks for that, John. Two questions, really. First question is, we've consistently throughout this legislation and these amendments, whenever lands or resources have been discussed, we've stated that it's out of the scope of this legislation, because nowhere in the legislation does it talk to lands and resources. I'd say about 3 or 4 times we've voted that this was out of scope because of that. And I'm wondering, how is it that now in the last day of this, under a taxation clause, that we're looking at adding a amendment that would possibly stop any kind of future discussions or evolving of a treaty? Basically, I'm not a Métis person, I'm a First Nations person, but I would have deep problems with members of this committee deciding what in my future, I could negotiate with the Government of Canada. It seems deeply paternal, deeply problematic, and while we've not talked about lands and resources in the past, and we've made sure that we've had really strong non-derogation clauses to ensure that we're not infringing on First Nations rights or resources or land, that this would take an additional step towards telling Métis what they could negotiate with our government in the future. And for our committee to believe that we have the ability to do that, I think is an affront to the Constitution, which doesn't create rights. It recognizes and affirms that these rights have existed all along. And just to get ahead of ourselves a little bit with the land back study, which I was delighted to read, we heard from the Métis about the land that they were dispossessed of with Métis script, some of the land claims that they were promised in Saskatchewan and parts of Alberta that we'll be discussing later on and making recommendations on what the Métis should be doing about getting their land back in terms of what was promised to them in original script or that are very similar to treaties. But this committee getting a front of all of that and saying that we as a committee believe we know best what this government and Métis should be negotiating in the future, and putting it in a taxation clause at the end of it. And so, Mr. Chair, I'd like to hear why this is admissible from our people that are here, but also, I guess hearing from our technicians, our legal folks, what are their thoughts on us telling the government as a committee and the Métis people what they could negotiate in the future as a throw-in clause in this part of the line by line.
Okay, we'll turn to our officials first if you'd like to make a comment to Mr. Baptiste's question on why the admissibility of this one.
I think, I understand what Mr. Baptiste is saying. The way that the testimony at this committee has unfolded, many of the Métis governments that are to be represented through this legislation, if passed, had a chance to speak at the front end, and now we're here as government officials and as the negotiator for this bill trying to speak to their interests and their perspectives. I would agree, and I know that the Métis governments that this bill is meant to represent find this concept offensive. They think that it's a restriction that hasn't been placed on other Indigenous governments in implementing legislation. And it really does prohibit a potential set of conversations in the future. Understanding that there are, for example, Mr. Baptiste has pointed to script claims, which have a long history in Canada and a long history of, the dispossession of Métis peoples for over 150 years. And so I don't know that I have anything to add other than to say that as the negotiator who's helped co-develop this legislation and the agreements and who will help to co-develop the self-government treaties, that it's my understanding that our partners take a similar view to Mr. Baptiste.
Okay, Mr. Baptiste, anything and follow up?
Can I get 5 minutes just to talk to the stakeholders about this? Just suspend the meeting for 5 minutes just so I can have a conversation?
Okay, yeah, we'll suspend for 5 minutes, and then I have Ms. Edlute also on my list. So we're suspended. Our 5-minute suspension went a little bit beyond, but we're back. Now, I have, Michael, I see your hand is up. I'm going to confirm with you, first of all, if you want to speak to this discussion or if it's a technical issue that you're having or a point of order. So I do have you on the speaking list, but just need to know what your, if it's the discussion.
I wanted to take part in the discussion.
Okay, perfect. So I have you on the list. Now, the first thing I'll start with is I was asked for the chair's position or ruling on this. And so in discussion with our legislative team, I'll give you just briefly the ruling on why this is deemed to be in order as opposed to out of order. The understanding of CPC 5.01 is that it reiterates the fact that C-53 does not grant Métis governments and the Government of Canada the ability to enter into treaties regarding any rights or claims that pertain to land or resources. Procedurally, this is interpreted as a limitation rather than an expansion on the scope of the bill, and therefore the amendment is admissible. If it was to be an expansion, it would not be admissible, but because it's a restriction, it is admissible. So that's why it's on the table before us for discussion. So with that, I have Ms. Idlut, then Mr. McLeod, and then Mr. Schmale on my speaking list. So Ms. Idlut, to you first.
Kuyanamik, and I'm thankful for the few minutes that we had to have a break. And thank you to Jaime for asking those very important questions because it definitely made me reconsider whether I'd support this amendment. Sorry, Michael, can you repeat again what you said about treaties being evolving? How did you say that again?
Yeah, I'm happy to try to repeat what I had said moments ago. The Crown Indigenous Relations has been increasingly developing policy positions, for example, and expanding on the mandates that we have at negotiation tables to recognize that treaties, rather than taking the sort of full and final, what was used to be called the certainty approach, that treaties need space to evolve over time. They're enduring documents that are meant to provide added clarity and predictability around it, what is ultimately an evolving relationship. And so I think the point that I was trying to make earlier was that to put this limitation on self-government treaties that are contemplated in this bill with the Métis Nation of Ontario, Métis Nation Saskatchewan, and Métis Nation of Alberta is to put a limitation that hasn't been placed on the other Aboriginal peoples of Canada as recognized in the Constitution.
Thank you. I really appreciate you repeating that and helping clarify. I think that what I do need to say is that treaty making was never a fair process for First Nations. First Nations never had been heard in the same way that what we're hearing for these three Métis nations in Ontario, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. So in that sense, Bill C-53 is unprecedented, where First Nations, during their negotiations, did not have the same weight given to their voice by the federal government. When we're hearing about treaties never really being implemented the way they were intended to be, has been a concern for over 150 years. So when it came to this bill and the concepts of treaty and the concepts of self-government for Métis, as it naturally flowed to the concerns and issues the last 150 years by First Nations and other Métis. So I think that's why this scrutiny was so important, that when we're seeking fairness, we're seeking fairness for all Indigenous peoples, that those First Nations who were not given the same opportunities through words like what you've said, Michael, that the relationship with First Nations is evolving, that treaties need space to evolve, opens the doors for First Nations to come back to you to make sure that treaties are evolving, that when we're talking about treaties that, for example, might have been silent on water, still need to be allowed to discuss water. We know that, for example, there's been years of concerns about the lack of rights being respected because of treaties towards Indigenous peoples. This conversation helps open the doors to First Nations who've been not treated with equity, to First Nations and other Métis who've not been given the same opportunities that we've heard of today. Having said that, and having heard your explanation about what this limits for future treaty making, those limits existed for First Nations. But I will still oppose. I've changed my position on this provision. I will oppose this amendment because of what we've heard, because of what we need to do to uplift all Indigenous peoples.
Thank you, Ms. Idlut. Next, I have Mr. McLeod.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize for being late. My computer decided to update itself and then wouldn't let me sign in. I'm listening with great interest and a little bit of surprise, I guess, as a Métis person and as an MP that represents a riding with 3 different Métis organizations in that are in negotiations, or 2 in negotiations and 1 has an application for negotiations. And we've already settled with a number of Métis across the territories on this very issue. And, you know, in the Northwest Territories, the Métis are negotiating, the Northwest Territories Métis and the Métis across the Mackenzie and in the Decho and are negotiating land. They're negotiating royalties. They're negotiating regulatory participation. They want to be part of the decision making. So I find it strange when we have all these Indigenous governments working towards rebuilding their nations, reconstituting their nations, that we have an MP from Alberta, which is an hour and a half away from me, trying to do the opposite. I feel that Mr. Verson is blocking his own constituents from moving forward, and it's certainly creating a wedge. I think amongst the Métis people in Alberta. I have talked to the Métis Nation of Alberta. I've talked to the Métis settlements. They want this exact same thing that the Métis in the Northwest Territories are negotiating, and in some cases have already settled. So we're really going to have a double standard across this country if we have one group of Métis enjoying all the benefits of being partners with governments where they can stand shoulder to shoulder and be part of decision making, something we never had for 150 years. We didn't sit at the table when decisions were made, but we need to be there. The intentions of all these agreements all across the country was to be able to coexist, to co-manage. Well, this certainly doesn't lend towards that. And I think, you know, the injustice that were done in the past when it came to script with the Métis may not have been totally the government's fault, but they're the ones that brought in the script traders that bought up all the script agreements. to the point where in the north and even part of Alberta, I think they took the land issue out of the script because they were being swindled. The Métis were being swindled as the people were coming across, the government parties, the treaty partners were coming across, they were bringing wagon loads of whiskey, and they were taking the script as people were signing it. So the script in the Northwest Territories, it doesn't include land because they felt that it was wrong, and the rest of the country was becoming very aware of what was happening and raising concern. And let's not forget that the Métis in Alberta and the Métis included in this bill all have protection under the Daniels case. And if this amendment is going to go forward and got the intention of what some of these Indigenous governments are trying to achieve, we're going to end up in court. And I feel it certainly goes beyond the bill. I feel it's going to stick a stick in our spokes. We should be working towards supporting Indigenous governments to stand on their own 2 feet. That means we have to settle all these different issues. And treaties are intended and should have always been treated as living documents. Agreements that are evergreen on 3, 5, 10, whatever the case may be, on increments where a review is done. Because what is agreed on today is not necessarily right for tomorrow. You know, we have a number of land claims that are settled in the Northwest Territories, and many of the Indigenous governments are looking back and saying, well, things have evolved so much that some of these sections of our agreement, our land claims agreement, or self-government agreement, don't make sense anymore. We need to redo them. So it's a little bit upsetting to see this bill come forward from the Conservatives. I thought we were all on the same page moving forward, trying to make sure that Métis governments, First Nations governments, Inuit, we're all on the right path to right some wrongs from the past. But I don't think this amendment does that. I think rather it really going to do a lot of. It's going to make a lot of cause a lot of problems for the Métis, and it's certainly not fair because they're the only ones that are going to be dealing with this. It doesn't. You never see this with a Inuit agreement. You never see this with the First Nations agreement. We don't see this with other Métis organizations and the governments, except for the ones involved in this bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McLeod. I'm going to go to Ms. Rempel-Garner first, and then Mr. Schmale.
Thank you, Chair. I'll just say this. I am, and I have been following this debate, very struck by the flawed nature of the bill. And I find it deeply disappointing that a government that is purportedly trying to progress in a spirit of reconciliation would put forward a bill that is just so flawed that it's actually pitting stakeholders, pitting people against each other, as opposed to trying to come up with common ground. And here we are today. I frankly don't understand why we are debating a bill that has caused so much division. The actual spirit of debate on this has been antithetical to reconciliation, and I'll just leave it at that. This is unbelievable. Thank you.
Thank you. And now, Mr. Schmale, you're next on my list.
Thank you, Chair, and I appreciate the comments from my colleague, Michelle Rempel-Garner. I couldn't have said it better myself. Michelle comes to this committee I believe, for her first time studying this bill, and in this one meeting, she's recognized the amount of division this government has caused with this bill. And it's truly unfortunate, especially given the extra time they had to work on this bill. How many months had they promised to table this bill, and it never came forward, only to be tabled at the last second before we recessed in June? It's extremely frustrating. They should have done their homework. They didn't, and because of this, we have a bill that Indigenous groups are against Indigenous groups. It's truly unfortunate. Having said that, we do recognize the comments from the stakeholders. We do recognize their feelings on this amendment, and we accept them as they had brought to our attention. And I move that we withdraw this amendment.
Okay, and so to withdraw, I require unanimous consent. So looking around the room to see if we have unanimous consent. There is unanimous consent. So CPC 5.01 is withdrawn. Okay, thank you. So we will move on to then Clause 15. Do I have any discussion, any speakers on Clause 15? Okay, seeing none, I'll call the question on Clause 15. Shall Clause 15 carry on division? Okay. Next, colleagues, shall the short title carry on division? Next up, we would have CPC 11. Does anyone want to move CPC 11? I do have a ruling by the chair on CPC 11, should it be moved. And this was Mr. Viersen having put forward CPC 11. No. Okay, so CPC 11 is not being moved, so we'll go past that one. Okay, so next is shall the preamble carry? On division. Shall the title carry? On division. Shall the bill as amended carry? On division. Shall the chair report the bill as amended to the House?
J'aimerais juste un vote par appel nominal.
Can we just do a recorded division? I'm just going to request a recorded division on the last part because you just asked the committee to adopt the bill as amended because the interpretation was going a little too fast.
Okay, fair enough. So I'll ask if the bill shall, as amended, carry on recorded division.
Sorry. Yes.
We're doing a recorded vote on shall the bill carry as amended carry, based on the request by our colleague from the bloc.
Mr. Baptiste.
Yes.
Mr. Carr.
Yes.
Ms. Gainey.
Oui.
Mr. McLeod.
Yes.
Ms. Atwin.
In favor.
Mr. Schmale.
In favor.
Madame Rempel-Garner.
Abstention.
Mr. Zimmer.
Abstain.
Mr. Melilo.
Abstain.
Monsieur Lemire.
Contre.
Ms. Idlout.
Ngaktunga in favor.
Seven yeas, one nay.
So the bill as amended shall carry. Next, shall the chair report the bill as amended to the House? Mr. Baptiste?
Just before we get to that final piece, I just want to make sure that we thank the presidents of the Métis who've shown up every single meeting, and they've been here through us, helping us guide through this legislation. And I just want to make sure that you know how deeply in gratitude the members of this committee are for your continued guidance and wisdom. And we didn't always, get the results that we wanted, but this was a process that we benefited from you being here. So thank you for the presidents, and I just wanted to acknowledge you all and for your hard work getting to where we are in this before we move forward.
Thank you, Mr. Baptiste. So the question I have is, shall the chair report the bill as amended to the House? I said, I'm asking if the chair shall report the bill as amended to the House. Okay, on division. And then finally, shall the committee order a reprint of the bill as amended for the use of the House at report stage? Okay, we'll say yes to that. So, colleagues, with that, we have concluded our review of Bill C-53. Thank you to each of the members and those who have substituted. Thank you so much to our officials. And as Mr. Batiste said, I'd like to thank all of the members of the Métis organizations, the Métis Nations of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Ontario for your dedication to and your input to this very, very important piece of legislation. So thank you. Colleagues, I've had two things before we adjourn. So first of all, Mr. Zimmer would like to speak, and then I want to go quickly to the travel discussion. So Mr. Zimmer, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'd like to resume debate on the motion that I had brought forward last week. The motion, especially, and with the consideration the member from Northwest Territories is with us today, but also a recent statement by the Deputy Premier in the Northwest Territories. We mentioned R.J. Simpson previously, but these are the comments from the Deputy Premier. I get that people are a bit frustrated and anxious, she said. I think a lot of people have some frustration about the fact that we are recently, and in the last few weeks here, into a very particularly cold season. People are using more heating fuel now. The cost of heating fuel itself, volatile, and that's not something that I have any control over. It's only the tax on top of that, she added. So in that spirit, and there is a...
Sorry, Mr. Zimmer, can I interrupt just for a second?
Yes.
I apologize for this. I should have offered to our officials, if you'd like to leave the table, we're beyond C-53 now, and so I don't want to hold you here for this. So please feel free to make your exit. If you want to stay, you're more than welcome to. You're like family here. But if you want to go, I will I'll make you that offer. Thank you. Yep, back to you, Mr. Zimmer.
Mr. Chair, I'll get back to the comments by Carolyn Wozniak, the Deputy Premier of the Northwest Territories. So I'll read the motion again for the room. That given that the Premier of the Northwest Territories has requested a complete exemption from the carbon tax for his jurisdiction, the committee invite the Premier of Northwest Territories, R.J. Simpson, to appear on this request for carbon tax exemption and the challenges Northwest Territories face with the cost of living, and that the committee report to the House that it calls on the government to immediately carve out Northwest Territories from the carbon tax. So again, kind of reiterating that with the spirit, it appears that the legislature in Northwest Territories is going to move forward with their own. This is a real opportunity for us to have their backs and to really back them up on their legislation rather than coming in and saying Ottawa knows best and blocking them from doing so. So I'll put that before committee to discuss and look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Okay, Ms. Rempel-Garner, you're first on my speaking list.
Thank you so much, Chair. I strongly support this motion. I think the way that the government has approached carve-outs to the carbon tax is inequitable and, frankly, against the spirit of nation building. And also, it ignores valid concerns of many First Nations communities across the country that are reliant upon different types of heating fuel, and you know may be facing challenges outside of and greater than looking at ways to, let's say, install a heat pump. Right. You know, there are communities across the country that do not have clean drinking water. So I find the way that the government approached the Atlantic Canadian carve-out to the carbon tax and then saying nothing for the rest of the country, a blatant piece of disgusting vote grabbing. The reality is as well, Chair, the reason why I would encourage colleagues to support this is when we are looking at the issue of climate change and coming up with solutions to address that in the country, the government's present carbon taxation policy does not reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It doesn't work. And the fact that there's such a dogmatic adherence to it, it's actually stifling policy innovation in other areas. So when we do have subnational governments that are looking at opposing it, because Canada is not, it's not Germany, it's not a small European, or it's not a country that is this temperate. We're a large, cold, natural resource-based country that is also dealing with nation-to-nation conversations with First Nations, Indigenous persons, and the carbon tax it's a failed and flawed policy instrument as it is designed right now in Canada. it's flawed, it doesn't work, and it's problematic. So, given the comments, as my colleague Mr. Zimmer has said, of elected officials in this part of the country, I hope that this committee would support this motion. And certainly it would just spur the government into realizing that they have taken a flawed approach. At the very least, I hope that the Liberal caucus raises this in their caucus meetings. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Idloot, I have you next on my list.
Just a quick technical question. If we do approve this motion, what's the order? Like, because I know that we have other motions for study. Can you remind us again how that would work?
Yeah, at this point, where we're at is now that we've concluded C53, the next business that we have is the review of version 1 of the education study. When we finish version 1, then we have the land restitution study draft that we need to go through. We don't have any passed motions yet for whatever the next study would be. And so if this motion passes, I would look to the committee on timing and whether we'd want to interrupt the review of either of those two reports. And then as we get into the land restitution study, that's when I was going to bring up the committee business to have us then look at motions from the Conservatives are next for their study, then the Bloc, then the NDP, and then the Liberals. So we'll move through that rotation of getting topics sorted out. But I wasn't going to have that discussion until we got into the land restitution report, because we have lots of work to keep us going. There's also a couple of pieces of legislation that are in the House that could be coming to us as well. But should this motion pass, I would look to the committee on timing and when they would, when the committee would want to have that motion implemented. So hopefully that answers your question, Ms. Idloot. Okay, thank you. Next, I have Mr. Batiste.
Yes, Mr. Chair, and we'll be voting against this. And, you know, I just want to say, since, you know, this is an ability to speak about what's going on in my riding, but we have a state of emergency called by the province of Nova Scotia, by the mayor of the Cape Breton Regional Municipality, by First Nations leaders in my riding, because of unprecedented snow that they've never seen before in 100 years in my riding. More than 140 centimeters of snow. I'm getting calls from people saying that they can't get out of their road, they can't get to dialysis appointments because of the snow. We're hearing that plows are getting stuck, and this is all because of the climate crisis we're dealing with. In the past 2 years, we've had 2 state of emergencies in my riding. We've had 2 storms of the centuries in my riding, and for us to say that, you know, as a committee, we're going to be looking at making the price of pollution free again, to me, is just something that we can't do at this stage. For coastal communities, for northern communities, they're dealing with the cost of climate change that's in the millions, hundreds of millions, just for Fiona. And we don't know what this is going to cost us. And so we're going to be voting against this. But also, I think it's important to recognize that the provincial territorial leaders also have a part to play in this. I was watching a Instagram post from the newly elected Premier of Manitoba, who said it's because of the provincial government that they have reduced taxes and have the cheapest gas in Canada. The provincial premiers have it within their power to ensure that this is something that they can do. It's not all on the federal government, but we hope to continue to fight climate crisis and do everything in our power, because it's impacting Indigenous communities more than it's impacting other places in Canada. We learned that in the United Nations last year at the permanent forum, which I'm hoping that committee members might want to go back to again in our travel time in April. I'll throw it out there, which we'll get into next. But for these important reasons, you know, we're having this debate, but I'd like to get to a vote on this, and because I think we have important issues that we need to move forward on, including legislation.
Okay, Mr. McLeod, I have you next.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I think it's important that if we're going to bring a motion forward for a vote in a committee, that the information is correct. And I know Mr. Zimmer has tried many times to bring this forward, and in this case, he's referenced the Premier making a request for an exemption. there has been no such request. So I'm not sure what we're going to study. If the Premier has not made a request, the Deputy Premier has not made a request, and in fact, the cost of living offset is coming up for debate in the Legislative Assembly. I believe we'd certainly be creating some influence on that discussion as a federal, as federal MPs. I believe that there's going to be a good debate on it. In fact, the cost of living rebate may be considered for increase. So I'm not sure why Mr. Zimmer from BC wants to bring a motion forward that involves NBT. I know his position and the government's position has been to interfere with other regions as MPs. We've seen the super boards being shoved down our throats here in the Northwest Territories. We've seen MPs opposing the Truth and Reconciliation recommendation, the murdered and missing. All these things were being blocked by MPs in other jurisdictions. So I'd like to call a question on this. Let's get it to a vote. But I would rule it out of order if I was the chair because the information is not accurate. There is no request from the Premier.
Okay, we are going to go through our speaking list and then we'll have the vote. So Mr. Zimmer, you're next, and then Mr. Lemire, you're next.
Yeah.
Then Ms. Rempel-Garner, then Ms. Idloot.
So I have great respect for the member from Northwest Territories, but it's a CBC article from December 10th, 2023. The title says, Northwest Territories Premier says he wants complete carbon tax exemption for territory. And he's actually quoted in the article to say, I mean, ideally, a complete exemption for the territory is what we would hope for, said R.J. Simpson, chosen this week as Premier of the Northwest Territories in an interview Sunday on Rosemary Barton Live. Further quoted, the costs are already high. Higher costs are not the solution up here. So I don't think it gets much clearer, and maybe the member hasn't read that article or hasn't maybe seen that himself.
Point of order, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair.
Okay, Mr. McLeod, your point of order.
Mr. Chair, the point of order is there is no formal request. It might have been mentioned in the media, but there is no formal request.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. McLeod. That is getting into debate. So, but noted. I'll let Mr. Zimmer finish.
Okay. Yeah, so just to clarify that, I think we clarified that very well. But speaking about the nature of Ottawa Knows Best, and the member says that we're proposing something to that effect, I think it's the exact opposite. We're actually trying to put on record in this committee that we're going to respect the territory's decision to pursue an exemption because, as was said before by Minister Guilbeault, that it'd be his job if any further exemption was granted after we saw the granting of that to the Atlantic Canadians that use home heating oil. I'll further quote the Deputy Premier. I think the Premier has spoken to this. This is from INAN SL, a periodical that's well known in the territories. I think the Premier has spoken to this. This is a quote again. This is a tax that is putting the North in a position to pay for something that we actually have a very small contributor to, GHG emissions, with one of the least opportunities to get ourselves off those GHG emissions because they have to stay warm in the cold. She added, this is really why we wanted to hang on to control of it because the federal government, in this instance, made a change that benefits people who use home heating fuel in their homes, but in other cases could just as easily make a political decision that would not benefit all people. She finishes, we would want to be insulated from being directly impacted from a political decision coming from Ottawa. We've been holding on ourselves to having our own system in the North that was designed in the North, meant to apply in the North, end quote. So, I mean, the whole principle, this started by, and the member would know well, somebody in Northwest Territories was formally allowed to be granted rebates on home heating. And then I think it was last April, the Prime Minister said, sorry, you can't do that anymore. You can't grant rebates to your citizens anymore, the carbon tax. And so it put people that live in Northwest Territories in this very difficult position, and their leaders as well. And again, I'll refer to Jackie Jacobson. I call him the carbon tax warrior. He was one of the ones standing up and saying, hey, folks, we already have out-of-control food prices up here. Now we're seeing a quadrupling of the carbon tax, too. It's going to be implemented and mandated across the country by the Prime Minister. And it looks like they're not allowing Northwest Territories to do what they wanted to do in their own offering of rebates. So again, that's the spirit of this motion, is to support the people of Northwest Territories. And if they decide, and again, we've seen in the news that this might come up this week in their legislature, this is an opportunity now where the federal government can say, hey, we support you folks, especially in the north. We know you're a very small contributor to GHG emissions. We heard it mentioned in committee today, but here's a real opportunity to help folks that are struggling in the north. And we as a committee can come forward and say, we support you. And that's, again, what this motion is about. And I challenge every member to vote yes for this motion today. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Zimmer. Monsieur Lemire.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Simplement pour vous.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The bloc will be voting against this motion. Thank you.
Ms. Rampel-Garner, you're next.
Just briefly, two points, Chair. First of all, I know I listened to Mr. Batiste's comments about the impact of the carbon tax, but I would note that Atlantic Canada was the one that got the carve out, so I'm not sure if he's suggesting that it should be uncarved out. Right. So he might want to clarify that, but he could clarify that during the study.
Exactly.
Right?
That's the point of this.
Ask this. And I would also argue to the point that was made about the Premier of the Northwest Territories requesting the carve-out. The premiers of the Atlantic provinces, their formal request was standing up day after day in the media and going, we will not accept this, particularly after, I think there was one particularly abysmal by-election result in Nova Scotia for the Liberals on this issue. So I would just say this, if colleagues want to debate whether or not the Premier of the Northwest Territories wants this carve-out, we could have an opportunity to have him here and talk about it. So we should pass this motion, and if my colleague opposite would like to say that the carbon tax should be uncarved out for Atlantic Canada, he could do so there too. Another reason to have the study.
Thank you. Ms. Idlut, then you're next.
When I asked about other study ideas, I looked up a motion that I had provided, and it was on water. Is that still on the list?
The motion is still there,
Okay.
but we haven't carried it, is my recollection.
Okay.
Yeah, but
All right, thank you.
yeah. Okay, I have no other speakers, so let's call the vote on this one. Would you like a recorded vote, or okay, recorded vote on the motion from Mr. Zimmer?
Monsieur Baptiste.
Against.
Mr. Carr.
Against.
Ms. Gainey.
Against.
Mr. McLeod.
Against.
Ms. Atwin.
Against.
Mr. Schmale.
It's me instead.
Oh, sorry, Madame Ferrari.
I know, I look just like him. 4.
Terribly sorry. Mr. Zimmer.
Yeah, in favor.
Madame Rempel-Garner. Mr. Melillo.
In favor.
Monsieur Lemay.
Contre.
Ms. Idlout.
Kapunga against.
Okay,
7 yeas, 4 nays.
okay, thank you. Okay, so that doesn't carry. Colleagues, the next thing I have on my list, do we want to take a minute to talk about travel? Does anybody have any ideas that you'd like to put out that we could direct our team to cost out over the next few days? I'll go with Ms. Idlut and then Mr. Batiste. If anybody else wants to weigh in, please do. Ms. Idlut, you're first.
In the previous discussion, I had suggested that we go to Thunder Bay, Ontario. Depending on whatever study that we do, I'm still interested in going to Thunder Bay, Ontario. Thank you.
Sorry, and to clarify, is that related to the study that you're proposing on the water study from the NDP?
Whatever the topic of the study is, I think that there are many different kinds of issues that we could explore in Thunder Bay, which has a huge several First Nations communities. So if we end up at the time between April and June are studying water, then that's what I would suggest we go there for.
Okay. Is there, to help us do costing, do you have any idea of how many days you would think we would like to be there for the topics that you're anticipating, just to help with building the budget or the proposal?
Not at this point, but I could work on one before the deadline.
Okay, yeah, if perhaps by Wednesday, if that's not too soon, if you can come back with some thoughts, and we'll save some time at the end of the meeting to give your thoughts to the clerk and to share with the committee, and that will give us time to build a proposal to be entertained by the committee. Okay, Mr. Batiste.
Yes, there's been some conversations, and I think that one of the options that is potentially on the table I'd like for us to discuss is the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. From April 15th to 26th, they will be having their discussions. This year, their theme is Enhancing Indigenous Peoples' Right to Self-Determination in the context of the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, emphasizing voices of Indigenous youth. And I think this is something that many of us were able to go to the United Nations last year, and I thought that it was great. We had a lot of very good dialogue with Indigenous people from around the world, and I think it's a very informative few days, and I think that if we scheduled from the first part, from the 15th to the 18th, with the fact that all of us as MPs get at least one trip to New York, I think it's 2 that we're allowed per year. It wouldn't take our flight budget. It would just take rooms and for those members who are traveling. And so I know that I've talked to our vice chair about this, and I don't know if he's given any walking instructions to Conservatives on what this could potentially be, but I hope there'd be some discussion on the possibility of us going to the United Nations Permanent Forum in New York on those dates.
Okay, so that's another one we can have a look at building a proposal for to explore. Okay, Monsieur Lemire, Mr. Carr, and then Monsieur Lemire. Mr. Carr, you're first.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Ben, en ce sens-là, effectivement...
My mistake. Mr. Carr first, and then you.
Okay.
My mistake. Mr. Carr.
I'm Jewish. It doesn't work on me. I can catch my thought here. Churchill, Manitoba. Churchill plays a vital role, not only in Manitoba, but for the entirety of the North. I think there are a lot of very interesting things that we could look at there, ranging from national defense policy to international exports from the Port of Churchill to education to infrastructure, internet infrastructure in particular. There are a couple of very fascinating energy projects currently being considered. I think that it's a place that people would enjoy. It's a place that people would see the potential for that exists in terms of the increasing importance that the North is going to play in our country. And the invitation would always be there, I know, from Mike Spence, the mayor of Churchill, and others in Manitoba. So I understand it's a little bit further, a little bit harder to get to, but depending upon where the issues being undertaken for study from this committee go, that would be an interesting cross-section. So I put that out there, not perhaps with as much enthusiasm as some of my colleagues for their respective choices, but nonetheless, it's there, it's not going anywhere, and if we don't get to it this time around, perhaps it's something we can be mindful of moving forward. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. And now, Monsieur Lemire, you have the floor.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Ben, évidemment, il me ferait...
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, it would be my pleasure to welcome you in Abitibi-Témiscamingue. There's a Kitsikaakik community there that might be particularly interesting, but I would like to put forward an idea about the United Nations Forum. The 15th to 26th of April, the Parliament will be, we'll have a break week from the 22nd on, so we might use that week so that we're not losing any time for our studies over here. Thank you.
That insight and those comments. Ms. Idlout, you're next.
I just wanted to withdraw my Thunder Bay proposal for now. I'll try and propose it at another time because I do support Jaime's suggestion to go to the UN.
Okay, thank you. All right, so We'll circulate the suggestions that have come out today and ask members to give a bit more detail to it for our next meeting, and decide if there's one or multiple of the submissions that we want to further develop and to meet the deadline of February 16th. The last thing, quick reminder, this Wednesday we will be starting our review of the version 1 of the education study. So I'd encourage all members to go through that and have your comments ready to go. And as we've done previously, we'll go through the contents, the body of the report first, and then recommendations at the end. So that'll be the order of the flow. And with that, colleagues, I have nothing further. We are adjourned.